Stay silent, Elizabeth, or leave this house. 7 years of marriage, 1 daughter, 1,000 quiet sacrifices. And this was what Leonard Ashford, the Duke of Wexford, offered his wife when she brought him the truth about his own brother. She had the proof. She had the numbers. £12,000 stolen from dying children who would never know a single name behind their suffering. And the man she loved told her to be quiet. If you've ever been silenced by someone who should have protected you, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? The candles in the east drawing room had burned low by the time Elizabeth Ashford spread the last of the papers across the mahogany writing table. She had been at it for 3 days. 3 days of cross-referencing, ledger entries against bank receipts, matching signatures against correspondence, tracing the movement of funds through 4 separate accounts, all while managing the household, supervising Clara's lessons, and ensuring that nothing about her demeanor at supper gave Leonard any reason to ask questions before she was ready. She was ready now. Her hands did not shake when she gathered the documents into a neat stack. She had expected them to. She had prepared herself for the trembling, for the sick, hollow feeling of confirming what she had only suspected 6 weeks ago, when a clerk at the Yorkshire Charitable Trust had sent a routine accounting discrepancy notice to the estate, a notice addressed to the Duke that had been opened as all estate correspondence was by Elizabeth first. The discrepancy had been small. £47, unreconciled against a disbursement record from the previous autumn. £47 became 400. 400 became 4,000. And 4,000, by the time Elizabeth had followed every thread to its origin, became £12,362, stolen, methodically, over the course of 4 years, from a children's hospital that Leonard Ashford had endowed with his father's name and his own reputation, and that the people of Yorkshire believed was the finest evidence of ducal generosity in the whole of the north of England. She carried the papers down the corridor toward the library, where Leonard always spent his evenings after dinner. The house was quiet around her. Clara had been asleep for 2 hours. The staff had retired to their quarters. The only sound was the soft knock of her heels against the marble floor, and beneath that, the low creak of the wind pressing against the window casements. She stopped outside the library door. For one moment, just one, she allowed herself to feel what she had been refusing to feel for 3 days. Not fear. Something older and more complicated than fear. The particular grief of a woman who has spent 7 years building something she believed in, only to discover that the foundation was cracked before she ever laid the first stone. Then she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and opened the door. Leonard sat near the fire with a glass of port and a parliamentary report he was not reading. She could tell he wasn't reading it because his eyes were unfocused and his jaw was set in the way it always was when he was thinking about something he didn't want to think about. He looked up when she entered. Elizabeth. A mild acknowledgement, neither warm nor cold. The tone of a man who had grown accustomed to his wife's movements through his house without needing to pay particular attention to any one of them. I need to speak with you about the Ashford Children's Hospital Fund. Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm. Not quite. More like the careful calibration of a man deciding how much attention a statement deserves before he commits to a response. It's rather late for estate business. It's not estate business. She placed the papers on the reading table beside his chair. It's a matter of criminal fraud. Leonard set down the parliamentary report. He picked up the top page from the stack she had placed before him, and he read it. She watched his face while he read. She had learned over 7 years to read Leonard Ashford, the way she had learned to read financial ledgers, by knowing which details were significant and which were designed to obscure the ones that mattered. He set the page down. He picked up the second one. By the time he reached the 4th page, she could see the color had drained from the sides of his jaw. "Where did you get these?" It wasn't a question. It was the voice of a man who already understood the answer and was deciding what to do with it. "From the Charitable Trust's own records. From our bank. From the correspondence files in your estate office." She kept her voice level and precise. "The disbursement records do not match the receipts. The gap is £12,000. The gap began 4 years ago when Thomas was appointed fund administrator. The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Leonard did not move. Thomas, she continued, has been diverting funds from the hospital account into a private holding account at a bank in Leeds. The transactions are small enough individually that they wouldn't attract scrutiny in a standard review. But when you map them against the hospital's actual construction and operating expenses, which are documented in the Trust's annual reports, which I have obtained from the Yorkshire Trust Secretary, the pattern is unambiguous. Leonard rose from his chair. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her, and one hand braced against the frame, and she could see the tension in his shoulders from across the room. You went to the Trust Secretary. I wrote to him requesting the reports. It was a routine inquiry. You went outside this household with questions about a family financial matter. I went outside this household with questions about where £12,000 of donated money went. She let that stand for a moment. Donated money, Leonard. Given by people who believed it would pay for sick children to have medicine and beds and doctors. He turned around. The firelight fell across the planes of his face, and for a moment, Elizabeth saw something she recognized: the man she had married, the one who had stood in a country church in Berkshire and spoken his vows with a directness she had found at 24 profoundly reassuring. He had seemed then like a man who meant what he said. You should have come to me first, he told her. Before you went anywhere else. Before you pulled any records. You should have come to me. I'm coming to you now. You're coming to me with a finished case. His voice was quiet and precise and careful. You've already decided what happened. You've already decided who is responsible. You've already been in contact with people outside this family. Because the evidence is clear. The evidence is your interpretation of documents that you may not fully understand. She felt something harden in her chest. Not anger, not exactly, but the close cousin of it that comes from being told by someone who should know better that you have misread something you have read correctly. I managed the household accounts for this estate for 6 years before you hired a steward, she said. I reconciled every quarterly statement with the bank. I oversaw the renovation of the north wing at a cost of £7,000 without a single discrepancy. I believe I understand financial documents. Estate accounts are not. The math is the same, Leonard. She stepped forward and placed her finger on the top page of the stack. £12,362, in, out, through Thomas's hand, into an account that does not belong to the Ashford Children's Hospital. The math is the same. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Leonard looked at the papers. He looked at her. He walked back to the table and picked up the stack and held it for a moment, as though weighing it against something invisible. What exactly, he said slowly, is it that you want me to do with this? Report it, to the trust board, to the authorities if necessary. Recover whatever funds can be recovered and make the hospital whole. And Thomas. Thomas stole from a children's hospital. She said it quietly without heat, because the absence of heat seemed more powerful than fury would have been. What happens to Thomas is a consequence of what Thomas chose to do. Leonard put the papers back on the table. He turned to face her fully. If this becomes public, and it will become public, Elizabeth, the moment you involve any authority outside this house, the Ashford name will be destroyed. Everything my father built. Everything I have maintained for 20 years. The hospital itself will suffer because donors do not give to institutions that have been touched by scandal, even institutions that are the victims of that scandal. That is a reason to recover the money and correct the record. That is a reason to handle this quietly, internally, without. There is no internal solution that makes £12,000 appear in a hospital fund, Leonard. She kept her voice even, but she felt the truth of what she was saying press against the inside of her ribs. The money is gone. Children are being treated in wards that should have been renovated. Medicines are being rationed that should have been fully supplied. The quiet internal solution you're describing is one in which those children continue to suffer so that no one outside this house learns that your brother is a thief. His expression changed. Not to anger. To something more dangerous than anger. The carefully controlled stillness of a man who has decided that a conversation has gone somewhere he will not permit it to go. That is not. Then tell me what the quiet solution is. Tell me how we restore the money without anyone knowing it was taken. Tell me how the hospital is made whole without Thomas being held accountable. Tell me the solution that protects both the children and the family name, and I will listen to every word of it." Leonard was silent. "There isn't one," she said. "Is there?" The fire snapped. A log shifted in the grate. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the windows, and the old house groaned faintly around them like something alive. "Stay silent, Elizabeth." His voice was very quiet. "Or leave this house." She heard the words. She understood them not just as a command, not just as an ultimatum, but as a revelation. 7 years of marriage, and this was the architecture of the thing she had built her life inside. Protect the name. Maintain the appearance. Endure whatever must be endured to keep the surface of the Ashford world exactly as it had always appeared. She looked at her husband. She thought about Clara asleep upstairs, who at 5 years old already had her father's dark eyes and his precise, careful way of observing the world before she committed to any response. She thought about the hospital in Yorkshire that bore the Ashford name and the Ashford promise, where children who had no dukes for fathers lay in beds that should have been better furnished and received medicines that should have been more plentiful. She thought about £12,000 and 4 years and a stack of papers that told a story no one in this family wanted told. "I will not be silent," she said. Leonard's jaw tightened. "Then you understand what I said." "I understand exactly what you said." She picked up the stack of papers from the table. "I am going to keep these. I am going to write to the trust board in the morning. And I am going to take Clara to my sister's house in Bath while you decide whether you are going to be the Duke of Wexford or whether you are going to be the man I married." She turned to leave. "Elizabeth." She stopped. She did not turn around. "If you do this," he said, "there will be no returning from it. Not for you. Not for our daughter. The world you are choosing to enter, the world where the Ashford name is publicly disgraced, is not a world that will be kind to either of you. The world where sick children go without care so that your brother can pay his gambling debts is not one I'm willing to live in quietly." She walked out of the library. She did not run. She did not cry. She walked with the same steady, deliberate pace she had used when she brought the truth into the room, because she had decided somewhere in the past 3 days of ledgers and receipts and sick dawning certainty that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it as herself. Not as a woman frightened into action, not as a wife backed into a corner, as Elizabeth Whitmore. Ashford, who understood numbers, who understood what they meant, and who had decided that understanding them obligated her to act on what they said. She was at the top of the stairs when she heard Leonard's voice below, low and controlled, speaking to no one, because there was no one to speak to, because she had already gone. She did not stop to hear what he said. She went to Clara's room, stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her daughter breathe in the darkness, and made a list in her head of what they would need to pack in the morning. The journey to her sister's house in Bath took 2 days by carriage. Clara asked twice why they were going without Papa, and accepted both times with the equanimity of a 5-year-old that sometimes Mama needed to visit Aunt Margaret without Papa because Papa was busy with important work. Clara did not ask a third time. She spent most of the second day of travel with her forehead pressed against the carriage window, narrating the landscape to a small cloth rabbit named Henry, in a voice too low for Elizabeth to quite hear. Margaret Whitmore had been married for 11 years to a solicitor named Aldous Farrow, and she lived in a comfortable, slightly cramped house in the older part of Bath with an abundance of opinions. 3 boisterous sons, and a quality of frank perception that Elizabeth had spent most of her adult life simultaneously relying on and dreading. She opened the door herself. When the carriage arrived, the maid was apparently occupied with one of the boys who had trapped himself in the pantry and took one look at her sister's face and said nothing at all, which was so uncharacteristic of Margaret that it told Elizabeth everything she needed to know about what her own face looked like. "Come in," Margaret said instead. "The boys are somewhere catastrophic. I'll make tea." Clara was installed in the small upper bedroom with Henry the rabbit and a bowl of biscuits and Margaret's youngest, who was 6 and immediately devoted. Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup and told her sister everything. Margaret listened without interrupting. This was also uncharacteristic, and Elizabeth found that it made the telling easier. No interjections, No exclamations, no commentary on Leonard's failings or Thomas's character. Just Margaret's steady, quiet attention and the sound of the fire in the kitchen grate. When Elizabeth finished, Margaret poured more tea. "You have the documents," she said. It was not a question. "I have copies. I left the originals with Leonard, but I made copies before I presented them to him." "You expected he might not respond well." "I hoped he would respond well." Elizabeth curled both hands around the cup. "I planned for the alternative." Margaret studied her across the table with that particular Whitmore look, sharp, unhurried, slightly merciless in its accuracy. "And the trust board. You said you intended to write to them. In the morning, after I've slept." She paused. "If I still think it's the right thing to do in the morning." "Do you think you'll think differently in the morning?" "No." "Then write tonight." Elizabeth looked at her sister. "You might feel less certain in the morning," Margaret said simply. "Not because you'll be wrong, but because you'll have slept, and your body will have had time to understand what your mind has already decided, and your body is going to strongly suggest that there is still a version of this where you go back to Wexford and agree to the quiet solution and everything continues as it was." "There isn't, though." "I know." Margaret's voice was gentle and uncompromising at once. "So write tonight." Elizabeth wrote that night at Margaret's small writing desk, by the light of 2 candles, with the sound of the boys still audible somewhere in the upper floors, despite the hour. She wrote to the chairman of the Yorkshire Charitable Trust, with precise, clear, unemotional language. She described the discrepancy she had identified. She described the records she had obtained and the analysis she had performed. She enclosed copies of the most significant documents. She requested an immediate audit of the fund's accounts and a review of all disbursements made under the administration of Thomas Ashford. She sealed the letter. She did not read it again. She gave it to Margaret's husband's clerk in the morning to be dispatched with the day's post. 3 days after the letter was dispatched, a carriage bearing the Wexford crest arrived in Margaret Street. Elizabeth was in the garden with Clara when she heard the knock at the front door, and she did not go inside. She stayed where she was watching Clara attempt to convince a disinterested garden cat that Henry the rabbit wanted to be its friend, and she listened to the murmur of voices from inside the house. Leonard's voice, and then Margaret's, and then a silence that lasted longer than she would have expected. When Leonard came to the garden door, he was not what she had expected either. She had expected the Duke of Wexford. The controlled public faced the careful eyes, the tone calibrated to suggest that whatever the difficulty it could be resolved with sufficient dignity and patience. What she saw was a man who looked as though he had not slept in 3 days. Clara saw him first. Papa. She launched herself across the garden with the total, joyful abandon of a 5-year-old who does not yet understand that the adults she loves have broken something between them. Leonard caught her, held her with both arms, pressed his face briefly against the top of her hair. Then he set her down and told her that the cat looked as though it might benefit from more convincing, and Clara immediately returned to her project with renewed focus, and Leonard walked toward Elizabeth. He stopped a few feet away. "The trust board acknowledged your letter," he said. "They've appointed an independent auditor." "I know. They sent me their own acknowledgement." Something moved across his face. Surprise, perhaps, that she was already informed. Or something more complicated, the recognition that while he had been 3 days at Wexford deciding what to do next, she had been here in Bath already 3 steps further along. "Thomas knows," he said. "I told him yesterday." Elizabeth waited. "He didn't deny it." Leonard's voice was very controlled. "He had explanations, justifications. He said the hospital fund was poorly managed before he took over. He said he had intended to return the money once his financial situation improved. He said—" He stopped, drew a breath through his nose. "He said that everyone protects their family." "What did you say?" Leonard looked at her directly. "I said that wasn't protection. That was cowardice disguised as loyalty." The garden was quiet. Clara had managed to attract the cat's attention by producing a biscuit from somewhere in her pinafore. Henry the rabbit observed from a safe distance. "You could have come to me," Elizabeth said quietly. "Before I came to you. You'd had 4 years of fund reports. The discrepancies were there for anyone who looked. I didn't look. There was no excuse in how he said it, just the flat acknowledgement of a fact. I trusted Thomas, and I trusted that the accounts were in order because I wanted them to be in order. And because examining them would have required me to believe something about my brother that I didn't want to believe. Yes, I chose comfort over accuracy. And then when you brought me accuracy, I chose the family name over the truth. His jaw tightened. I am telling you this, not because I believe it changes what I said to you. I'm telling you because you deserve to understand what I actually did, rather than what I told myself I was doing. This was not what she had expected him to say. She had expected justifications. She had prepared herself for justifications. The trust board's auditor will find what I found, she said. Likely more. They have access to records I couldn't obtain. I know. The press may become involved. I know. The Ashford name, Elizabeth. His voice was quiet. I know. I have spent 3 days understanding very clearly exactly what is going to happen. To the name. To the family. To Thomas. To me. He looked at her steadily. I need you to understand that I am not here to argue against any of it. I am here because... He stopped. He looked at Clara, who had now achieved the impossible and was carrying the garden cat victorious toward Henry. I am here because I owe you the truth, and I have not given it to you until this moment. Elizabeth looked at her husband. She thought about £12,000 and 3 days of ledgers and a letter she had written by candlelight, while her daughter slept and her sister sat in the kitchen doorway, offering the particular comfort of simply being present while someone else did something hard. Truth is not the same as trust, she said. You can tell me the truth today. That doesn't rebuild what was broken. I know that too. They stood in the garden in the gray afternoon light, while Clara informed the cat that Henry was very friendly actually, and the cat expressed its skepticism in the universal language of all cats everywhere. I'm not coming back to Wexford, Elizabeth said. Not yet. Clara and I will stay with Margaret while the audit proceeds. Leonard nodded. When it's over. She chose her words carefully. When I can see what you choose to do, not what you say you intend to do, then I'll know what the next thing is. He held her gaze for a long moment. That is fair, he said. He stayed for 2 hours for Clara's sake, and perhaps for his own. He ate a meal at Margaret's table with the uncomfortable dignity of a man fully aware that his sister-in-law found him presently insufficient, but was too well-bred to say so at dinner. He played with Clara in the garden until the light went. He told her a story at bedtime about a rabbit who was braver than any knight, and Elizabeth, standing in the corridor outside the half-open door, listened to her daughter's delighted laughter at each twist of the tale, and felt something in her chest that was very complicated and not yet ready to be named. When Leonard left, he paused at the front door. The hospital, he said quietly. Whatever it costs to make it whole, I will cover it personally. Not from the estate fund, from my own income. Quietly and completely, and without expecting anything for it. She looked at him. That's not enough, she said. But it's a beginning. He nodded once and put on his hat and walked out to the carriage. Elizabeth stood in the doorway until the crest disappeared around the far corner of the street. Then she went back inside and helped Margaret clear the dinner things and sat with her sister by the fire until late, talking about nothing in particular, and was grateful beyond measure for the ordinary comfort of it. The audit took 11 weeks. Elizabeth read every report the trust board sent her. She annotated them. She corresponded twice with the auditor, a methodical man named Carstairs, who seemed to Elizabeth's quiet satisfaction genuinely impressed by the quality of her preliminary analysis. He told her in his second letter that her documentation had shortened his work by at least 3 weeks. She did not tell Leonard this, but she filed the letter carefully with the others. The final audit confirmed £12,418 diverted. £56 more than her own calculation, representing 2 transactions she had not been able to trace to their final destination. Thomas Ashford had been systematic and patient, and had counted correctly on the assumption that no one would look closely enough. He had not counted on Elizabeth. The trust board convened a formal hearing. Leonard attended. Thomas attended with a solicitor. The outcome was not in doubt. The documentation was thorough. The evidence was unambiguous, and Thomas Ashford had already, in a private meeting with Leonard and the board chairman, acknowledged the substance of what he had done. What was in doubt was what came next. Leonard could have managed it quietly. The board would have permitted it a private restitution, a quiet resignation from the fund administration, no public disclosure. The Ashford name preserved. The matter handled with the maximum possible discretion that the situation allowed. He did not choose that. Elizabeth learned what he had chosen from a letter not from Leonard himself. A letter written to her directly in his careful hand 4 days after the board's final hearing. The trust board has agreed to a full public disclosure. A statement will be issued to the press in the name of the Duke of Wexford, acknowledging the fraud, confirming the restitution of all misappropriated funds, plus accumulated interest, and expressing without qualification the Duke's personal apology to every donor who gave to the hospital fund, in the belief that their contribution would reach the children it was intended to serve. I am writing to tell you before you read it elsewhere. Thomas will face a civil proceeding. I will not stand in its way. The disclosure will damage us. I understand that. I am choosing it because a woman I had asked to be silent was right, and the least I can do is say so loudly enough that the people she was right about can hear it. Elizabeth read the letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it with the audit documents and sat for a long time at Margaret's writing desk while the November rain came down against the window and Clara's voice floated down from upstairs telling Henry the rabbit about something of enormous importance. She did not cry, but she allowed herself for the first time in 11 weeks to feel the full weight of what had been broken and what might slowly be rebuilt, and to understand that those were two entirely different things and would require two entirely different kinds of courage. The public disclosure ran in 4 newspapers on a Thursday morning in late November. Elizabeth read it at Margaret's breakfast table with Clara eating porridge beside her and the fire going, and the ordinary sounds of Margaret's household filling the rooms around them. The boys arguing upstairs, Aldous leaving for his office with his coat only half buttoned, the maid dropping something metallic in the kitchen and swearing under her breath before catching herself. The statement was measured precise and completely without evasion. Leonard had written it himself. She could tell from the syntax, the careful architecture of each sentence, the way it moved from fact to acknowledgement to consequence, without ever veering into the self-justifying language that solicitors tended to insert when they got their hands on documents like this. He had not softened it. He had not permitted it to be softened. The Duke of Wexford wishes to inform the public that an internal audit of the Ashford Children's Hospital Charitable Fund has revealed a systematic diversion of donated funds, totaling £12,418 over a period of 4 years, carried out by the fund's administrator, Mr. Thomas Ashford. The Duke accepts full moral responsibility for the failure of oversight that permitted this fraud to occur, and offers his unqualified apology to every donor, every trustee, and every patient of the hospital whose welfare depended upon the proper stewardship of these funds. Full restitution, including interest, has been made from the Duke's personal account. A civil proceeding against Mr. Thomas Ashford is underway. Margaret read it over Elizabeth's shoulder without comment. Then she refilled both their teacups and sat back down and said, "He didn't hide behind the family name." "No. I didn't expect that." Elizabeth folded the paper. "Neither did I." But even as she said it, she wasn't certain that was entirely true. She had known Leonard Ashford for 9 years, 2 before their marriage, 7 within it. She had seen him at his most controlled and at his most compromised, and she had learned to distinguish between the moments when his pride was a wall and the moments when it was armor over something more tender. The man who had ordered her out of his library had been defending the wall. The man who had written that statement had taken the armor off. Those were not the same man. Or rather, they were the same man, and the distance between those two versions of him was exactly the distance she did not yet know how to measure. Clara looked up from her porridge. "Is Papa in the newspaper?" "Yes, love." "Is it a good thing or a bad thing?" Elizabeth looked at her daughter's serious dark eyes, Leonard's eyes in a face that was still entirely its own. "It's a true thing," she said, "which is the most important kind." Clara considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old who has learned from years of watching her mother that when her mother says something quietly, it deserves to be thought about. Then she returned to her porridge. "Henry thinks true things are the best things," she announced, "even when they're hard." Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Elizabeth looked back at the folded newspaper. "Even when they're hard," she agreed. The letters began arriving on Saturday. Not from Leonard, though. His letters came too short and factual and consistent brief updates on the civil proceeding on Thomas's solicitor's maneuverings on the trust board's next steps. These were different letters. They came from people Elizabeth had never met, addressed care of the trust board forwarded to her in Bath women, mostly who had read the disclosure and done the additional reading required to learn that it was a duchess who had identified the fraud, and who wanted her to know that they had read this and that it mattered to them. A school teacher in Harrogate, who had organized her pupils' parents to donate to the hospital fund 4 years ago, and had wondered ever since why the ward improvements seemed so slow to materialize. A shopkeeper's wife in Leeds, who had given £5 at a fundraising dinner, and felt she wrote that she had been made a fool of. Except that now she understood she had not been made a fool of. She had simply been defrauded, which was a different and more specific thing, and knowing the specific thing made her feel less foolish and more resolved. A woman in York, older from the careful formality of her handwriting, who did not explain why she was writing, except to say, "I spent 23 years married to a man who told me my opinions on financial matters were not my concern. I am glad someone's were." Elizabeth read each letter carefully. She answered each one personally in her own hand. Margaret watched her work through the correspondence one evening and said, "You know the papers are calling you the investigating Duchess." Elizabeth didn't look up from the letter she was writing. "I'm aware. Aldous says it's the most interesting thing to happen in the peerage in 15 years. Aldous practices estate law. His threshold for interesting is specific. He also says—" Margaret paused in that deliberate way that meant she was about to say something she had already decided to say, regardless of whether it was wanted. "He says Leonard has been managing this remarkably well, given the circumstances." Elizabeth finished the sentence she was writing before she responded. "Leonard is doing what he should have done 8 weeks ago. Yes, but he's doing it without trying to redirect any of the attention toward the person who actually caught the fraud. He'd better not. I caught it." "Elizabeth." Margaret's voice was unusually quiet. "I'm not defending what he said to you in that library. You know I'm not. I'm saying that there are men who would have spent the past 11 weeks attempting to minimize their wife's role in this, or to cast the whole affair as their own decision, once they'd had time to review the evidence, and he hasn't done any of that. He told the board chairman in the first meeting that the fraud was identified by the Duchess of Wexford." Elizabeth looked up. "Aldous was present at that meeting," Margaret added. There was a silence. "He should have said that," Elizabeth said. "That's the truth." "Yes, and there are men who wouldn't tell the truth when the truth makes them look insufficient." Elizabeth set down her pen. She thought about a man standing in a garden in Bath in a gray afternoon telling her that he had chosen comfort over accuracy with no excuse in his voice and no attempt to reshape the narrative into something more flattering to himself. She thought about a letter written in careful handwriting that said, "The least I can do is say so loudly enough that the people she was right about can hear it." "I know," she said. "That doesn't mean you have to go back. I know that too." Margaret nodded once the way she did when she had said the thing she intended to say and was now prepared to let the matter rest on its own weight. "More tea, please." The civil proceeding against Thomas moved faster than anyone had anticipated, largely because Thomas's solicitor, faced with the quality of Elizabeth's documentation and Carstairs' audit, advised his client that contesting the evidence would be both expensive and unsuccessful. Thomas entered a settlement in December. Full civil liability acknowledged a formal repayment schedule established from the sale of his personal properties, a lifetime bar from serving as an administrator of any charitable fund. Leonard wrote to Elizabeth the day the settlement was confirmed. The letter was 6 sentences long. "Thomas's proceeding has concluded. The terms are as I hoped. The hospital board has confirmed they will proceed with the ward renovations beginning in the spring, funded by the restitution and by a supplemental gift from the estate. I attended the board's meeting yesterday. They asked me to convey to you formally in the board minutes their gratitude for your diligence. I thought you should know that it is recorded in an official document that the Ashford Children's Hospital owes its integrity to the Duchess of Wexford. I thought you should know that I agree with them. Elizabeth read the letter 3 times. Then she set it with the others. The neat stack of Leonard's correspondence that she had been keeping in the same folder as the audit documents, as though the two things were part of the same record, which perhaps they were. She did not write back that night. She sat with the weight of those 6 sentences and let herself feel what they cost him to write the pride. It required him to put aside the particular humility of a man, acknowledging in writing that a wrong had been righted not by his own action, but by someone he had tried to silence. She was not ready to forgive him. She was clear about that inside herself, in the careful, honest way she had learned to be clear about the things that mattered. Forgiveness was a decision, not a feeling, and the feeling she had when she read his letters was something more complicated than either forgiveness or its absence, something that had no clean name, but felt when she pressed it carefully, like the earliest beginning of something she had not yet decided whether to tend. January came cold and relentless. Clara had been in Bath for 2 months, and had achieved in that time a complete social dominance over Margaret's household, that everyone in the house had adapted to with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for someone to organize them properly. She had assigned Henry the Rabbit a permanent chair at the breakfast table. She had established a weekly system for settling the boys' disputes that Margaret admitted was more effective than anything she had tried. She had convinced the garden cat, whose name Clara had determined was Captain, to accept Henry's presence in the garden with something approaching civility. She asked about her father with steady regularity, and Elizabeth answered every question as accurately as she could, without introducing complexities that a 5-year-old had no use for. Papa was in London for meetings. Papa was managing something important. Papa missed her very much, which was true. Leonard came to Bath a second time in January on a Sunday, with a carved wooden horse for Clara and a quiet, careful manner that suggested he had thought a great deal about how to occupy the same space as Elizabeth without making demands on it. He stayed for the afternoon. He played with Clara. He spoke with Margaret and Aldous with the slightly formal courtesy of a man who knows he is in a space where he is tolerated rather than welcomed, and who has decided to accept that with dignity. He helped clear the tea things without being asked, which made Margaret exchange a look with Elizabeth across the table that Elizabeth declined to engage with. Before he left, he stopped in the corridor where Elizabeth was standing, and he said quietly, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that whatever the answer is, I intend to accept it without argument." She waited. "I'm going to Yorkshire next month, to the hospital, to meet with the board to see the plans for the renovation, to be present in a way I should have been present for the past 4 years." He paused. "I wondered if you would come, not as my wife, not for any reason connected to us, because the hospital's board knows your name and your work, and because you understand the accounts better than any administrator they're likely to hire, and because—" Another pause, shorter. "Because you deserve to see the place that your work is about to actually help." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. She thought about £12,418. She thought about a schoolteacher in Harrogate, and a shopkeeper's wife in Leeds, and a woman in York who had spent 23 years being told her opinions on financial matters were not her concern. "I'll think about it," she said. It was the most honest thing she could offer him, and she saw him recognize it as such. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." He put his hat on and walked out into the January cold, and Elizabeth stood in the corridor and listened to the carriage start up in the street, and thought about Yorkshire and spring renovations, and what it meant to be recorded in an official board document as the person who had saved something. She thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day she wrote back. She wrote, "I will come to Yorkshire, as the Duchess, because that is what I am, regardless of where I am presently living, and because you are correct, that I have earned the right to see it. Do not interpret this as anything other than what it is." Leonard's reply came within 36 hours. "I understand completely. I am grateful. I have also separately arranged for the hospital board to formally acknowledge your contribution in their annual report. I did this without consulting you, which you may find high-handed. If so, tell me, and I will have it removed. But I thought the record should reflect what actually happened, and that you should not have to ask for that. Elizabeth read this standing at Margaret's writing desk, and something shifted in her chest, not dramatically, not conclusively, but perceptibly, like the first deep crack in ice that precedes a thaw. She wrote back, "Leave it in." The journey to Yorkshire in February was not what Elizabeth had expected. She had expected formality. She had expected the public presentation of a ducal couple presenting a united front, and she had prepared herself for the performance of it. The careful choreography of two people who have agreed to appear for a specific purpose as something they are not yet. What she did not expect was the hospital itself. She had read every report. She had traced every pound. She knew the ward layouts from architectural plans, and the patient numbers from quarterly summaries, and the staff complement from payroll records. She knew the hospital in the way that she knew ledgers as a structure of numbers that told a true story. She had not expected to know it as a place where things happened to people. The board chairman, a weathered man named Dr. Nathaniel Holt, who had been practicing medicine in Yorkshire for 30 years, and had the manner of someone who had very little patience for anything that was not directly useful, met them at the entrance. He shook Leonard's hand briefly. He shook Elizabeth's hand and held it for an additional moment. "Your Grace," he said, "I've been in medicine since before you were born. I have attended board meetings. I have written grant applications. I have argued with trustees and solicitors and parliamentary committees. In my experience, the person who actually identifies the problem is rarely the person who gets the credit for it." He released her hand. "I intend to correct that today." Elizabeth found to her own slight surprise that she had to work to keep her expression composed. Leonard stepped back deliberately, unmistakably, to let Dr. Holt lead her forward first. The hospital was smaller than she had imagined from the plans, and more alive. There were children in the wards, not abstractions, not statistics, but specific children with specific faces. Some of them sick enough that Elizabeth felt the weight of every delayed repair and every inadequately stocked medicines cabinet with a physical force she had not anticipated. A boy of perhaps 8 who watched her with large considering eyes, and then when she stopped beside his bed, solemnly showed her a drawing he had made of a horse. A girl of 3 who was asleep with one hand curled beside her face in the complete unconscious vulnerability of the very young. Elizabeth stood at the entrance of the children's ward and understood in a way that 12,000 numbers had not fully communicated what the money had been for. Leonard stood behind her. She heard him breathe. "Well," Dr. Holt said quietly, "now you've seen it." "Yes," Elizabeth said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were entirely still at her sides. "The renovation plans," she said. "The ones that will begin in the spring. Can I see the detail specifications?" Dr. Holt produced them immediately, with the efficiency of a man who had correctly predicted this question and come prepared. They went over them for an hour. Elizabeth and Dr. Holt and the hospital's treasurer, a young woman named Miss Prentice, who had been in the post for 18 months and who tracked Elizabeth's questions with the focused attention of someone learning something they intended to remember. Leonard sat slightly to the side and did not interject, and Elizabeth was aware of him in the way she was always aware of him, the particular quality of his attention, the way it felt when it was directed at her. At one point, she asked a question about the pharmaceutical supply contract, and Miss Prentice hesitated, and Leonard said from his position to the side, "I had the same question. I didn't know the answer either." Miss Prentice looked between them. "I'll find out," she said, and wrote it down. On the carriage ride back from Yorkshire, Leonard and Elizabeth sat across from each other in silence for the first 20 minutes. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have shared something real and are still inside the experience of it, not ready to convert it into words. Clara was at Margaret's. The carriage was quiet except for the road sounds and the wind. "Miss Prentice is good," Elizabeth said finally. "Exceptionally good. I'm going to recommend the board increase her salary. She should be the treasurer of record, not acting treasurer. The distinction matters to donors." "I'll tell the board." Silence again. The carriage rocked over a bad patch of road. "The boy with the drawing," Leonard said. "James." Dr. Holt had told her his name. "He's been there for 6 weeks. The drawing was quite good." It was. Leonard looked at her directly. "I keep thinking about the fact that he was there while the money was." He stopped. "I keep thinking that the ward he's in was on the list of renovations that were delayed. That he was in a room that should have been better than it was and wasn't, because Thomas needed money and I wasn't paying attention." Elizabeth held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." She said it without cruelty and without comfort, because it was true, and he needed to carry it, and she thought perhaps for the first time that he was strong enough to carry it without being crushed by it. "What I said in the library," Leonard said. "Stay silent or leave. Yes, I have thought about those words every day for the past 3 months." His voice was very controlled, and precisely because it was controlled, she could hear what was underneath it. "Not because of what they cost me, because of what they asked of you. Because I was a man who had watched you manage this family for 7 years with intelligence and competence and absolute integrity. And when you brought me the most important thing you had ever brought me, I told you your only options were silence or exile." Elizabeth looked at her husband. "I know why you did it." "Fear is not—" "I know why you did it," she said again more quietly. "That doesn't make it right, but I understand it, and I think you understand now why I couldn't do what you asked." "Yes." No hesitation. "Yes, I do." The carriage moved through the gray February afternoon, and Elizabeth watched the landscape shift past the window and thought about a boy named James and a drawing of a horse and a ward that was going to be renovated in the spring because £12,418 was being returned to the place it should have gone 4 years ago. "The annual report," she said. "The board's acknowledgement." "Yes. I read it." Leonard waited. "It was accurate," she said. "What it said about what happened. It was accurate." "I made certain it was." "I know." She looked back at him. "That mattered to me, more than I expected it to." Something in Leonard's face changed, not relief exactly, but the particular quality of a man who has been holding himself very still for a very long time and has just been given permission to breathe. "When we get back to Bath," he said carefully, "I'm not going to ask you to make any decision about anything. I want you to know that." "Good. I'm going to come back, if you'll permit it, on Sundays, for Clara. And—" he paused. "For whatever else you find you're willing to give." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. This man she had loved and been failed by and was still somewhere beneath everything not finished with. This man who had taken the armor off and was learning slowly and imperfectly, and with genuine difficulty, how to stand without it. "Sundays," she said. "Yes. That's enough. It's all I have right now, I know." His voice was quiet and entirely steady. "I know that. And Elizabeth—" He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and for a moment he looked less like the Duke of Wexford than like the man she had met at a country house party in Berkshire 11 years ago, who had argued with her about land reform over dinner, and looked startled when she argued back. And then she had always suspected, found that startlement the most interesting thing that had happened to him in years. "I want you to know that I am not coming on Sundays because I believe it will return things to where they were." "They can't go back to where they were." "No, but I think there may be somewhere else to go, if you decide you want to." Elizabeth looked at this man. She did not say yes, she did not say no. She said, "We'll see," and returned her gaze to the window. And that was the truth. Careful and unresolved and open-ended in the way that all true things are when they are still in the process of becoming. The carriage rolled south toward Bath. The gray winter light was thinning toward early dark. And Elizabeth Ashford, who had caught a fraud, who had left rather than be silent, who had been recorded in an official document as the person who had saved something, sat with the unresolved weight of all of it, pressing gently against her chest, and let herself quietly, and without rushing anything, begin to imagine what somewhere else might look like, The Sunday visits settled into a rhythm that no one in Margaret's household acknowledged directly, because acknowledging it would have required describing what it was, and no one, including Elizabeth, had a clean description ready. Leonard came every Sunday without fail. He arrived at the same hour each time, stayed until Clara's bedtime, and left without pressing for anything beyond what the afternoon offered. He never arrived empty-handed for Clara, not extravagantly, not with the theatrical generosity of a man trying to purchase his way back into favor, but with the small, precise gifts of someone who had been paying attention. A book about horses, because Clara had become obsessed with James's drawing and had been attempting her own versions in Margaret's sketch pad. A set of colored inks, because Clara had moved from pencil to ink with the confident ambition of a person who sees no reason to limit herself to one medium. A small brass compass, because Clara had declared with complete seriousness that she intended to be an explorer, and explorers needed compasses. Clara accepted each gift with the gravity of a person receiving something that had been correctly understood. Margaret's boys, who had initially regarded Leonard with the suspicious assessment of children encountering an adult who has upset someone they care about, gradually and reluctantly concluded that he was acceptable, largely because he did not talk down to them and was willing to be beaten at cards without making excuses. Margaret herself maintained a careful neutrality that Elizabeth recognized as her sister's version of restraint. She was polite. She made tea. She did not offer opinions unless Elizabeth asked for them, which Elizabeth appreciated more than she could have articulated, because she was still in the process of deciding what she thought, and Margaret's opinions, once expressed, had a way of becoming load-bearing walls in Elizabeth's own thinking. What Elizabeth was deciding through those February Sundays and into March was something she couldn't have named precisely at the start of it. It was not whether she still loved Leonard. That question had a simple answer that she was not ready to act on. It was something more complicated, whether the man who came to Bath on Sundays was a sustained version of the man who had stood in a garden in November and told her the truth about himself, or whether the sustained version would, under the right pressure, revert to the man who had told her to stay silent or leave. She watched for the pressure. She found it in April in a form she had not anticipated. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, not from Leonard, but from Lady Hargrove, whose husband sat on the parliamentary committee that oversaw charitable fund regulation, and who was one of the most socially authoritative women in the south of England. Elizabeth had met her exactly 4 times at events where the correct behavior was to be pleasant and unremarkable, and she had been both, and Lady Hargrove had paid her approximately the attention one pays to furniture that has been placed adequately. The letter was 3 pages long. It was on its surface an invitation to a reception at the Hargrove House in London for the benefit of a new charitable initiative supporting rural medical access. Lady Hargrove wrote that the Duchess of Wexford's recent contribution to the accountability of charitable institutions had been noted widely and with great admiration, and that her presence at the reception would lend the occasion considerable distinction. It was also, and Elizabeth read this between every line, because she had spent enough years in aristocratic society to understand that the lines themselves were rarely where the message lived a test. Lady Hargrove was offering Elizabeth a public re-entry into London society. She was offering it alone without reference to Leonard, and without making the invitation contingent on the state of the Ashford marriage. She was also by implication making clear that if Elizabeth chose to accept, she would be received as her own entity, as the investigating Duchess, as the woman who had faced down a duke and been right, rather than as a wife returning to her husband's side. Elizabeth read the letter twice at the breakfast table, then set it down and poured more tea and thought about it for the rest of the morning, while she helped Clara practice her letters and listened to Margaret's boys conduct some form of armed conflict in the upper floors that eventually resolved itself without adult intervention. She wrote back to Lady Hargrove that afternoon. She accepted. She told Leonard about the letter that Sunday, because she had decided weeks ago that whatever else changed between them, she would not manage information around him the way he had once tried to manage it around her. She put the letter on the table between them after Clara had gone up for her afternoon rest, and she said, "I've accepted this. I wanted you to know before you heard it elsewhere." Leonard read the letter without expression. When he finished, he set it back on the table. "Lady Hargrove doesn't do anything accidentally," he said carefully. She's telling you, and anyone who hears about this invitation, that you are a person of standing in your own right. Yes, that's exactly what she's telling me. And you accepted? I accepted. He looked at her. Good, he said. It was not what she had expected, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she had been braced for something other than that single unqualified word. I thought you might, she started. Find it threatening. His voice was even. That my wife is being publicly recognized as a person whose actions are worth honoring independently of her association with me. The thought crossed my mind. 6 months ago it would have. He did not look away. I've had time to understand the difference between my reputation and my character. They're not the same thing. My reputation was built on the Ashford name. My character is what I'm trying to build now, and a man with actual character doesn't feel threatened when his wife is honored for doing something right. Elizabeth held his gaze for a long moment. Will you come to London? She asked. To the reception. If you want me there, not otherwise. She thought about it. Yes, she said. I think I do. Something moved across his face, brief, controlled, and entirely genuine. Then I'll be there. The Hargrove reception was on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of April, and it was exactly as socially fraught as Elizabeth had calculated it would be, and she had calculated correctly, which meant she was prepared for every version of it. The room was full of people who had read the newspapers and formed opinions and were now in the process of recalibrating those opinions in real time, as Elizabeth Ashford, Duchess of Wexford, moved through the reception with a steadiness of manner that gave no one anything useful to work with. She was warm without being conciliatory. She was composed without being cold. When people asked about the fraud, and they did with varying degrees of directness, she answered factually, without drama, and watched their expressions adjust to accommodate a woman who was not going to provide the performance of either victimhood or triumph that they had perhaps been expecting. Leonard stayed 2 steps behind her for most of the evening, which was not where a Duke of Wexford typically positioned himself at social events, and which she suspected he was doing deliberately. Lady Hargrove found Elizabeth near the end of the first hour and took her by the arm with the proprietary ease of a woman who has decided that someone is worth the gesture. You are exactly what I expected, Lady Hargrove said, which is a compliment because I expected a great deal. That's generous of you, my lady. It isn't generous, it's accurate. She glanced briefly toward Leonard. He follows you rather than preceding you. He chose to, yes. I noticed. She looked back at Elizabeth. There is a woman here tonight, Mrs. Alderton. Her husband administers 3 charitable funds in the Midlands. She has been trying for 2 years to have an independent review of those funds conducted, and has been told each time that her concerns are unfounded and that she lacks the standing to compel any examination. Elizabeth looked at Lady Hargrove. She lacks the standing, Elizabeth said slowly. She is not a duchess. Lady Hargrove's voice was perfectly pleasant. You are. You want me to speak with her. I want you to decide, having spoken with her, whether you'd like to be involved in the matter. The decision is entirely yours. She tilted her head. But I thought you should know that there are £12,000 worth of problems in more places than Yorkshire, and that you have demonstrated a particular talent for finding them. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. I'll speak with her, she said. Mrs. Alderton was a small, precise woman of about 50, with the contained energy of someone who has been pressing against a locked door for so long that she has become very efficient at it. She and Elizabeth found a corner of the room and talked for 20 minutes, during which Mrs. Alderton produced from a small bag she had been carrying all evening a folded set of papers covered in figures. Elizabeth unfolded them. She looked at the numbers. She felt the familiar sharpening, the same quality of attention she had felt the first time she looked at the Ashford Fund discrepancy, that precise intellectual alertness that comes from recognizing a pattern inside what has been presented as random variation. These 2 columns, Elizabeth said, pointing. Yes. Mrs. Alderton's voice was careful and controlled. I've been told they represent administrative fees. What percentage of total disbursements do they represent? 11% in the first year, 17 in the second, 23 last year. Elizabeth looked up. Administrative fees that grow faster than the programs they administer. My husband says I'm misreading the categories. You're not misreading the categories. Elizabeth folded the papers back along their original creases. May I keep these? I brought them for exactly that purpose. Elizabeth tucked them carefully into her own small bag. When she found Leonard 20 minutes later, she said quietly, I need to speak with you about something. Not tonight. This week. He read her face. All right, he said. It isn't about us. I didn't assume it was. She looked at him. This man who 6 months ago had told her to be silent, who was now standing 2 steps behind her at a social event and asking nothing and reading her face with the careful attention of someone who has learned the hard way to pay attention. There may be another fund, she said. In the Midlands, I'm not certain yet, but the pattern looks familiar. Leonard was very still. Do you want help? He said carefully. Or do you want to work it out yourself first? It was the right question. It was so precisely the right question that she felt it do something to a part of herself she had been keeping very guarded. I'll work it out first, she said. And then I may need some of your contacts. You have them, whenever you need them. She nodded. She was about to move away when he said quietly, Elizabeth. She turned. You're good at this. No elaboration, no qualification, just the flat honest fact of it offered without agenda. You have always been good at this. I should have told you that years ago. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. You should have. She walked back into the room. She spent the rest of the evening being everything Lady Hargrove had expected her to be, which was she was beginning to understand a great deal. The Alderton papers took Elizabeth 3 weeks to work through, and at the end of 3 weeks, she had enough to be certain. The pattern was not identical to Thomas's. It was sloppier, less systematic, more opportunistic, but the principle was the same. Money designated for specific charitable purposes moved through administrative categories that the fund's ordinary oversight structure was not positioned to scrutinize effectively. She wrote a careful, detailed letter to the parliamentary committee that oversaw charitable fund regulation. She enclosed her analysis. She copied the letter to Lady Hargrove and to the Alderton Funds Trust Board. Then she wrote to Leonard. His reply came within 2 days. I have spoken with Sir Edward Brent, who sits on the committee. He has confirmed receipt and has requested a meeting. He has also asked, and I want to be clear, that I have neither encouraged nor discouraged this, whether you would be willing to present your findings in person. I told him that was your decision to make. I did also tell him that if he found your analysis anything less than thorough, he would be the first person in 6 months to make that mistake, and that his track record on such assessments would not survive the comparison. Elizabeth read this and felt something shift in her chest that was warmer and more specific than anything she had allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She wrote back, Tell Sir Edward I'll come. The committee meeting was in the 2nd week of May. Elizabeth presented for 40 minutes, answered questions for another 30, and watched 12 men around a table recalibrate their initial assumptions in real time as she demonstrated figure by figure exactly where the Alderton Fund's money had gone and exactly why the existing oversight structure had failed to catch it. Sir Edward asked at the end whether she would be willing to serve in an advisory capacity as the committee developed new regulatory standards for charitable fund administration. Elizabeth looked at him steadily. Tell me what the capacity entails, she said. Specifically. He told her. Specifically. Yes, she said. I'll serve. She did not look at Leonard, who was sitting to the side of the room. He had come not as the Duke presenting his wife, but as a supporting presence deliberately secondary. But she was aware of him in the way she was always aware of him, and she knew without looking that his expression was the same one he had worn in the hospital in Yorkshire when Dr. Holt had taken her hand and held it. She told Margaret that evening. Margaret put down her mending, looked at her sister, and said, So. Parliamentary Advisory Committee. Yes. At 31. That's how old I am, yes. Margaret picked up her mending again. Aldous is going to be insufferable about this, she said. He predicted something like this in December, and I told him he was being dramatic. Was he being dramatic? Apparently not. A pause. Are you happy? Elizabeth thought about it. Not the performed consideration of someone who has already decided and is giving the answer space to seem considered. The actual pause of someone taking honest inventory. I am doing something that matters, she said. And I am beginning to feel like myself again. Which is not the same as happy, but it's more solid than happy. It lasts longer. Margaret looked at her with that precise, slightly merciless Whitmore accuracy. And Leonard. Leonard is... She stopped, started again. Leonard is becoming someone I might trust. Not someone I trust yet. Someone I might. That's a very specific distinction. It's the accurate one. Is it enough? Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. It's what I have, she said. And I'm not going to pretend it's more than it is. But I'm also not going to pretend it's nothing. Because it isn't nothing. Margaret nodded. She returned to her mending. From upstairs came the sound of Clara informing Captain the Cat that Henry the Rabbit had been promoted to Admiral, and that this was a formal appointment and not subject to negotiation. Elizabeth listened to her daughter's completely confident voice delivering this ruling, and felt something in her chest open up, not dramatically, not all at once, promoted to Admiral, and that this was a formal appointment and not subject to negotiation. Elizabeth listened to her daughter's completely confident voice delivering this ruling, and felt something in her chest open up, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way of something that has been tightly held for a long time, beginning carefully to release. The letter from Thomas arrived on a Saturday morning in late May. Elizabeth had not expected it. In the months since the civil proceeding had concluded, Thomas had been absent from everything from correspondence, from Leonard's conversations, from Margaret's house, from Elizabeth's thoughts, where she had deliberately chosen not to give him more space than the facts required. He had done what he had done. The consequences had been applied. She had spent her energy on what came after, not on the person who had necessitated it. The letter was 2 pages. It was not, as she had halfway expected, an attempt at justification. It was not a request for leniency or an appeal for her intervention with Leonard. It was an apology, not a simple one. Not the broad, vague kind that costs nothing to write because it commits to nothing specific. Thomas had written in a hand that was less steady than she remembered it, the specific things he was sorry for. He named the hospital. He named the children. He named the delayed renovations, the rationed medicines, the wards that should have been better. He wrote these things without dressing them in any language that reduced their weight, and Elizabeth, who had spent 6 months becoming very good at reading what a person meant versus what they wrote, could find no angle of evasion in the 2 pages. At the end he wrote, I told my brother that everyone protects their family. He told me I was protecting myself. He was right. You were right before him. I am sorry it cost you your home to make either of us understand it. Elizabeth sat with the letter for a long time. She did not cry, but she allowed the weight of it to settle fully before she made any decision about it, because a letter like this deserved to be actually received before it was responded to. She wrote back that afternoon. She wrote, I received your letter, and I have read it carefully. I believe it is sincere. That is not a small thing, and I am not treating it as one. The harm that was done cannot be undone to the children, to the donors who gave in good faith, and to other people in the family whose lives were changed by what you chose to do. But I have believed throughout all of this that the point of telling the truth is not punishment. The point of telling the truth is that things become what they actually are, rather than what we pretend they are. If that has reached you, then something real has happened. I am not prepared to say more than that today. But I am glad you wrote. She sealed the letter and gave it to Margaret's clerk. Then she went upstairs to find Clara, who was conducting what appeared to be a naval tribunal for Captain, who had apparently violated some aspect of the new command structure. Elizabeth sat on the floor beside her daughter and listened to the charges being read aloud. Henry the Rabbit, presiding with great solemnity, and let herself be exactly where she was in this cramped, cheerful room in her sister's house in Bath, doing work that mattered, raising a daughter who was going to be formidable, navigating the slow, difficult business of deciding what her life was going to be made of. It was not what she had imagined 7 years ago, when she had stood in a country church in Berkshire and spoken her vows with complete sincerity. But she was beginning to understand something the imagined version had not accounted for. It was real. Every part of it. The grief and the work, and the letters, and the Sundays, and the slow cracking open of something that had been frozen, was real in a way that the careful surface of her previous life had not always been. Captain was found guilty. Clara announced the sentence community service, which apparently involved being more civil to Henry, with the authority of a person who expects compliance. Elizabeth watched her daughter's face entirely absorbed in the serious business of it, and thought about a woman in York who had written, "I am glad someone's opinions were her concern." Hers were. They always had been. And the world was beginning slowly and imperfectly to know it. The Sunday after the Thomas letter. Leonard arrived at his usual hour. He had barely settled into his chair when Clara, who processed significant information by stating it directly and without preamble, announced, "Thomas wrote to Mama." Leonard looked at Elizabeth. "He did," she said simply. "Did you?" I wrote back. I was quiet for a moment. Clara had moved on, satisfied that the information had been transmitted, and was now explaining to her father the details of Captain's tribunal, which Leonard listened to with the full seriousness it deserved. When Clara was upstairs, Leonard said, "You didn't have to respond to him." "I know. Whatever you said or didn't say, it wasn't owed. I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "I wrote back because it was the honest thing to do, not because it was owed. The letter was genuine, and genuine things deserve genuine responses. That doesn't mean I've forgiven him. It means I'm not going to be dishonest about what I received." Leonard looked at her. "You are," he said slowly, "the most morally consistent person I have ever known. I mean that as the highest compliment I am capable of giving." Elizabeth considered this. "I know you do," she said, "and I'm choosing to believe that you mean it, which is also a choice I'm making today." "What does that mean?" She looked at this man across Margaret's modest sitting room. This man who had failed her and was working visibly and imperfectly and without any guarantee of outcome to become someone who would not fail her again. "It means," she said carefully, "that some choices have to be made before you're entirely certain, and I have been entirely certain about very little for the past 6 months. But I am certain about this, that the man sitting across from me today is not the same man who told me to stay silent." Leonard held her gaze without moving. "I am certain," she continued, "that whatever comes next, it has to be built on what is actually true, not on what was, not on obligation or title or the name on the hospital in Yorkshire, on what is actually true between us now." "Yes." His voice was very quiet. "That is all I want. Then we start there." She did not say more than that. She did not need to. The gap between where they were and where they might yet be was still wide, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise was exactly the habit that had gotten them to that library in November. But it was a beginning. A real one. Built on ground that had been cleared of everything false, and that was, she was discovering the only kind of beginning worth the name. The beginning, as it turned out, looked nothing like Elizabeth had imagined it would. She had imagined in the quiet, honest part of her mind, where she kept the things she hadn't yet decided to want, something gradual and cautious, a slow accumulation of evidence that would eventually tip some internal scale and produce a clear decision. She had imagined herself arriving at certainty, the way she arrived at the end of a financial analysis methodically with documentation, each conclusion supported by the step that preceded it. What actually happened was messier and faster and far less comfortable than that. It started with a Thursday letter, not from Leonard, not from the parliamentary committee, but from the Dowager Duchess of Wexford, Leonard's mother. Elizabeth had not heard from her mother-in-law since leaving Wexford in November. This was not surprising. The Dowager was 72 years old, had been managing the Ashford family's social position since before Elizabeth was born, and regarded the entire situation. Elizabeth's departure, the public disclosure. Thomas's civil proceeding, with the particular silence of a woman who has survived enough family disasters to know that silence is frequently the most powerful available response. The letter was not long. "My dear Elizabeth, I have been watching what you have done for the past 7 months, and I have been considering what to say about it. I have decided to say this. You were right. Not merely correct in your arithmetic, though you were certainly that. Right in the way that matters, the kind of right that costs something, and proceeds anyway. I was not right in the early years of my own marriage about several things that I should have been right about. I did not have your courage. I am glad my son married someone who does. I hope you will come to Wexford, not for Leonard's sake, for mine, and perhaps a little for your own. Elizabeth read this at the breakfast table on a Thursday morning, while Clara ate toast soldiers and explained to Henry the rabbit the precise differences between admirals and commodores. She read it twice. Then she folded it and set it beside her teacup and sat with it for the rest of the morning. Margaret noticed the letter but said nothing until after the children were occupied and the two sisters were alone in the kitchen. "Well," Margaret said, "the Dowager, I gathered." Margaret poured tea with the efficiency of someone who has been conducting supportive kitchen conversations for years. "What does she want?" "For me to come to Wexford." "For Leonard." She said not for Leonard. Elizabeth turned the folded letter in her fingers. She said for herself, and perhaps a little for my own sake. Do you believe her? Elizabeth thought about the Dowager. A woman she had known for 9 years, had found formidable and occasionally frightening, and had never once in all those years heard say anything she did not mean exactly as she said it. "Yes," she said, "I believe her." "Then what are you going to do?" Elizabeth set the letter down. "I'm going to go to Wexford," she said, "and I'm going to bring Clara." She told Leonard that Sunday, and she watched his face do something that he immediately controlled, but not quite quickly enough. A flash of something urgent and unguarded that he tucked back behind his usual composure before it could develop into expression. She had seen that particular flash exactly once before years ago at a dinner party, where someone had made a cutting remark about his father's legacy, and Leonard had controlled his response so fast that only Elizabeth, who had been watching him, had caught what it cost him. "My mother wrote to you," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." "She didn't tell me she intended to." "I gathered that." A pause. "What did she say?" Elizabeth told him. Not the whole letter, those words belonged to her, but the substance of it. She watched him take it in, and she watched the thing it did to him, which was complicated and genuine, and not at all what she would have expected from the man she had left in the library in November. "My mother," Leonard said slowly, "is not a woman who uses the word courage lightly. I know. She means it as the highest thing she knows how to say. I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "You said you'd go." "I said I was going to go, yes." "When?" "Next week if Margaret can spare the room." "Margaret's room. Clara and I will stay at Wexford for a few days, and then I'm coming back to Bath." She held his gaze. "I need you to understand that I am going to see your mother and the house, and whatever that means. I am not coming back to stay. Not yet." "I understand." "Do you?" "Elizabeth." His voice was very quiet and very direct. "I have spent 8 months learning the difference between what I want and what I have any right to expect. I understand completely." She looked at this man and felt the complicated thing she had been feeling for months. The careful, reluctant, utterly inconvenient love that she had been managing like a wound. She wasn't certain would heal press against the inside of her chest with more force than usual. "All right," she said. "Then I'll see you in Wexford." The house was the same. This was the first thing Elizabeth noticed when the carriage came through the gates, that Wexford was entirely perfectly unchanged, as though the 8 months that had altered everything inside her had left the physical world of the estate untouched. The same gravel drive, the same proportions, the same quality of light in the mid-June afternoon that she had always loved about this particular house, the way it caught the sun from the south and held it. Clara pressed her face to the carriage window and said, "There's Captain's cousin," pointing at a gray cat that was crossing the drive with the purposeful air of an animal that has somewhere specific to be. "That's Mrs. Finch," Elizabeth said. "She's been here longer than either of us." "Does she know Henry?" "She's about to." Clara accepted this with satisfaction and began preparing Henry for the introduction. The Dowager met them in the entrance hall, not in any of the formal receiving rooms, Not with the domestic ceremony that would have signaled a performance, but in the hall itself, as though she had simply been passing through when they arrived. She was dressed plainly for her, and she looked, Elizabeth thought, older than 8 months should account for. Not ill. Just the particular aging of someone who has been carrying something heavy. She looked at Elizabeth for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara. "You," the dowager said directly to the 5-year-old, "have your father's eyes and your mother's expression. That combination is going to cause a great deal of trouble for a great many people." Clara considered this seriously. "Henry says trouble is how you find out what things are made of," she offered. Something moved across the dowager's face that Elizabeth had never seen there before. "Henry," the dowager said, "is very wise." She led them to her own sitting room. Not the formal drawing rooms, the dowager's private sitting room where Elizabeth had been invited exactly twice in 9 years. And she had tea brought, and she sat across from Elizabeth with the directness of a woman who has decided she is too old for approaches that are anything less than direct. "I owe you an apology," the dowager said. Elizabeth was very still. "I knew for 2 years before you found the documents that something was wrong with the fund accounts." The dowager's voice was even and utterly without self-excuse. "I did not know the specifics. I did not follow the thread the way you followed it. But I looked at the hospital's annual reports because I always reviewed the annual reports. It was my husband's foundation. I considered it my responsibility, and I saw that the rate of improvement did not match the rate of donation. I saw it, and I decided that there was likely a reasonable explanation, and that investigating further would create discomfort, and that discomfort within the family was something to be avoided." Elizabeth held her gaze. "I was wrong," the dowager said. "I had information that pointed toward a problem, and I chose comfort over investigation, and in doing so, I permitted something that you eventually had to stop at considerable personal cost. I am telling you this because you deserve to know it, not because I expect absolution for it." The room was very quiet. "Why are you telling me now?" Elizabeth asked. "Because Leonard told me what he said to you in the library. Not immediately, he told me in February after the audit concluded." The dowager's voice did not waver. "He said stay silent or leave. I want you to understand that the man who said that learned it somewhere. I am telling you that he learned it from a family that had been practicing that instruction for generations. That does not excuse him. But you should know the whole truth of what you were fighting against." Elizabeth absorbed this. "The whole truth," she said slowly. "I spent 50 years being the Duchess of Wexford," the dowager said. 50 years protecting the name. Managing what was said, and what was not said, and what was seen, and what remained private. I was very good at it. I was so good at it that I taught my sons without ever saying it explicitly that this was what loyalty looked like, that this was what family meant." She paused. "It wasn't loyalty. It was fear wearing the costume of dignity. And you, a woman of 31, who had been in this family for 7 years, understood that more clearly than I had in 50. I had less to protect," Elizabeth said. "I had less invested in the name. You had everything invested in it. You had your marriage, your daughter's inheritance, your social position, your home." The dowager looked at her steadily. "You had everything to protect, and you chose the truth anyway. That is not a matter of having less to lose. That is character." Elizabeth looked at this woman, formidable, aging, entirely undeceived about herself, and felt something she had not anticipated feeling in this room: respect. Not the careful, negotiated respect of a daughter-in-law managing her relationship with a powerful woman. The real kind. "Your son," Elizabeth said, "has been learning something similar, how to choose differently." "I know." The dowager's voice was dry and fond at once. "He is not a fast learner, but he is thorough. Once Leonard understands something, he does not unlearn it. That's what I'm counting on." The dowager looked at her with that sharp, precise assessment. "Good," she said simply. That evening, Leonard and Elizabeth walked in the garden after Clara was settled, not at his suggestion, not at hers, simply because they both arrived at the garden door at the same moment, and it would have been more awkward to turn back than to continue. It was the longest time they had spent alone together since the library in November. He did not try to make it into something it wasn't. "How was she?" he asked, about his mother. "Honest." "She usually is when she decides to be. She told me she knew something was wrong with the fund accounts 2 years before I found the documents." Leonard stopped walking. Elizabeth continued for 2 more steps before turning to face him. "She didn't tell you," she said. "No." His voice was very controlled. "She didn't. She told me instead. I think she needed to tell someone who would understand what it cost her to say it." He stood very still with that, working through it, with the thoroughness his mother had just described, the quality of a man who once he understands something carries it completely. "She's been carrying that since February at least," he said. "Since I told her what I'd said to you." "Yes, I think she has." "And she came to you with it. She came to me because she owed it to me. And because—" Elizabeth paused. "Because I think she saw in what she did 2 years ago what you did in November. And she needed you to know that what she sees in you, the choice to protect the name over the truth, she knows where it comes from." Leonard looked at her. "She's trying to take some of the blame. She's trying to give you an honest account of your inheritance. That's different from taking blame." Elizabeth held his gaze. "It doesn't change what you chose, but it gives it context, and context matters." He was quiet for a long time. The evening was warm, and the garden was full of the sounds of early summer birds, settling leaves, moving, the distant sound of something from the direction of the stables. "I have been thinking," Leonard said finally, "about what it would look like if you came back." Elizabeth waited. Not the surface of it, not the social presentation of it, the actual structure of what it would look like day to day. He turned to face her fully. "I have been thinking that whatever it is, it would have to look different from what it was. Not modified. Different." "Different how?" "You are on a parliamentary advisory committee. You have correspondence from 3 counties. You have women writing to you who need what you know how to do." He said this directly, without performance. "Any version of your life here that doesn't account for those things is not a version I'm offering you, because those things are not separate from you. They are you." Elizabeth looked at him. "You would have to give up a certain kind of authority," she said carefully, "in how the estate runs, the accounts, the decisions about what gets reviewed and what gets asked." "Yes. That's not a small thing, for a man like you." "No. No evasion in it." "It isn't. I'm offering it anyway." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I have spent 8 months understanding that the thing I was protecting was not the family. It was my own certainty that I was in charge of what the family was. And the cost of that certainty was that I nearly lost the only person in 20 years who has ever told me the truth without calculating whether I could handle it first." Elizabeth felt the words land somewhere very specific. "You could have kept that certainty," she said. "Most men in your position would have. I know. It would have been easier." "Considerably." He did not look away. "Elizabeth, I am not asking you to come back because it will be easier. I am asking because everything I have learned in the past 8 months tells me that the right thing and the easy thing are rarely the same thing, and I have spent enough time choosing easy." She looked at this man in the garden of the house that bore his name, the man she had loved and been failed by, and was still in the most inconvenient and irrefutable way not finished loving. "I need more time," she said. "I know. Not much more, but more. Take what you need. I want to come back when I'm certain, not when I'm merely hopeful." "I understand the difference." "Do you?" "Yes." His voice was very quiet. "I've been learning it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and turned toward the house, and he walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, but alongside, and that she thought was the most honest thing he had offered her yet. The next morning brought something none of them had expected. Elizabeth was at breakfast with Clara and the Dowager when the butler appeared with a card on a tray. "A visitor. At this hour." She looked at the card and felt something tighten in her chest. Lord Cavendish Holt. The name meant very specific things in the world of charitable fund regulation. Lord Holt was the senior member of the Parliamentary Oversight Committee, senior to Sir Edward, senior to everyone Elizabeth had dealt with so far, and he was known in the language of people who navigated these circles as a man who did not make social calls. He made political ones. She looked at the Dowager. The Dowager looked at the card. "Bring him to the morning room," the Dowager said. Lord Holt was 70, built like a man who had once been substantially larger and had reduced himself to the essentials, and he had the eyes of someone who had been reading people for 50 years and found the activity only moderately interesting because he was usually right about what he found. He looked at Elizabeth and said without preamble, "I've read your analysis of the Alderton Fund, and your original Ashford documentation, and the letter you sent to the committee in April." Elizabeth said nothing. She waited. "You found something in the Alderton numbers that 3 professional auditors missed." He sat down without being invited with the confidence of a man who does not require invitations. "I want to know how. I followed the growth rate of the administrative categories against the growth rate of the programs," Elizabeth said. "Auditors typically verify accuracy that the numbers add up. I was looking at whether the relationships between the numbers made sense." "That's not a standard audit methodology." "No." "Where did you learn it?" "I didn't learn it anywhere. I developed it by managing this estate's accounts for 6 years. She held his gaze. "When you manage accounts yourself, rather than review them after someone else has prepared them, you develop a sense for what relationships should look like. When a relationship looks wrong, you investigate the relationship, not just the arithmetic." Lord Holt looked at her for a long moment. "I want to propose something," he said, "and I want you to hear it before you respond." "All right. The committee is drafting new standards for charitable fund oversight. Sir Edward told you that. What Sir Edward did not tell you, because I asked him not to, because I wanted to come here myself, is that I want you to do more than advise." He put both hands flat on his knees. "I want you to design the methodology, the actual framework that auditors will use to review charitable fund accounts going forward, based on what you've developed. Standardized and codified and applied across every fund under parliamentary oversight." The morning room was very quiet. "That is," Elizabeth said carefully, "a significant undertaking." "It is. It will take at least a year, possibly 2. You would need staff. You would need access to the committee's existing audit records, which are extensive. You would need, frankly, a great deal of time and a great deal of authority, both of which I am prepared to formally grant." "Why me?" "Because you caught something that everyone else missed. Because you did it with resources that no professional auditor had specifically. Because you had been managing accounts yourself for years and developed an instinct that training alone doesn't produce." He paused. "And because you are the Duchess of Wexford, and in 1815 that matters to the institutions I need to persuade to cooperate with the new standards. I am being completely honest with you about that last point." Elizabeth appreciated the honesty of that last point more than anything else he had said. "I need to consider it," she said. "Of course. And I need to speak with my husband." Lord Holt's eyebrows moved fractionally. "I was not certain whether to expect that answer," he said. "He has relevant knowledge and relevant contacts, and this is his family's name on the original institution," Elizabeth said precisely. "Consulting him is practical, not deferential. The decision is mine." Lord Holt looked at her steadily. "Of course," he said again, and this time there was something in his voice that might in a younger or more expressive man have been approval. She found Leonard in the estate office after Lord Holt had gone, and she told him everything sitting across from him at the desk where she had spent 6 years reconciling quarterly accounts before he had hired a steward, and she watched his face move through comprehension and then through something more complicated. "A parliamentary methodology framework," he said, "based on what I developed, extended and codified. For every charitable fund under oversight." "Yes. That is..." He stopped. "That is not a small thing." "No." She looked at him directly. "It would mean I am in London frequently. It would mean I have a professional role that is entirely separate from this household. It would mean..." "Yes." No hesitation. "Elizabeth, yes. Those things are not problems. There will be people who think a duchess designing parliamentary audit methodology is remarkable, he said. The word is remarkable. And if anyone suggests otherwise, they will be having that conversation with me. She looked at him. I haven't decided yet, she said. I'm telling you because I said I would tell you things, not because I need your permission. I know. He held her gaze. I know exactly the difference. You're telling me because we are building something honest. And honest means I know what is happening in your life the way you know what is happening in mine. Not because either of us controls the other. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. He leaned forward with his elbows on the desk. There's something I need to tell you too, he said. Something I've been waiting for the right moment to say, and I think the right moment is now. She waited. When you left, he said. In November, after the library, I sat in that room for 4 hours. She hadn't known that. I went through the papers you left on the table. His voice was steady. All of them. Every page. And I found about 2 hours in that you had annotated the margins, small notations, clarifying which transaction corresponded to which account, making it easier to follow for someone who wasn't familiar with the trail. He looked at her. You had annotated those papers to make them clearer for me. For the man who had just told you to stay silent or leave. You had still, while preparing the documents that were going to expose my brother and damage my family, been thinking about how to make it easier for me to understand. Elizabeth was very still. I noticed that, he said quietly, and it broke something open in me that I don't entirely have the words for, because it told me what kind of person you are. Not what I thought I knew, what I actually knew if I had been paying the kind of attention that you had always deserved. The morning room was entirely quiet. I annotated them, she said finally, because I wanted you to understand, not because I was afraid of what you would do if you didn't, because I still thought even then that if you understood, you would choose correctly. You gave me more credit than I deserved. Yes. She held his gaze. And you're trying to deserve it now. I see that. I have been watching it carefully for 8 months, and I see it. Is it enough? He asked. The same question Margaret had asked her in a different kitchen months ago. She thought about Lord Holt's proposal. She thought about the framework she would build, and the year it would take, and the women who would write letters to her from Harrogate and Leeds and York. She thought about James in the hospital bed with his drawing of a horse, and the ward that was being renovated in the spring, and Dr. Holt holding her hand and saying that the person who identifies the problem rarely gets the credit. She thought about Clara and Henry, the rabbit's promotion to admiral, and a carved wooden compass given by a father who had been paying attention. She thought about a man sitting alone in a library for 4 hours reading annotated margins. It's becoming enough, she said. That's more than I expected. I know. She rose from the chair across from him. I'm going to write to Lord Holt tomorrow. And then I'm going back to Bath for 2 more weeks, and then... She stopped. She looked at the desk, the familiar surface of it, the accounts ledger sitting in the same position it had always occupied. And then I think Clara and I are going to come home. Leonard did not move for a long moment. To stay, he said carefully. To stay. She looked at him. Not to what it was, to what it is going to be. Yes. His voice was very quiet. To what it is going to be. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back, because there was one more thing that needed to be said. The thing she had been carrying since the morning room, since Lord Holt's visit, since the garden the night before, since 8 months of Sundays and letters and audit documents, and one small boy with a drawing of a horse. Leonard. He looked at her. When you chose the public disclosure, when you told the trust board the truth instead of managing it quietly, you said you were doing it because the least you could do was say it loudly enough that the people I'd been right about could hear it. She held his gaze. I want you to know that I heard it. I have heard every word of it. I am choosing to come back because of what I heard. He held her gaze for a long moment. Thank you, he said. Just that. No elaboration, no performance. The quiet directness of a man receiving something real and knowing how to hold it. She nodded once and walked into the corridor and let herself feel fully finally, without managing it, the complicated and genuine and not yet finished truth of what she was walking back toward. It was not what she had imagined when she had spoken her vows 7 years ago. It was harder than that, and more honest, and built on ground that had been cleared of everything false. She was beginning to believe the better version. The 2 weeks in Bath after Wexford were different from all the weeks that had preceded them. Elizabeth noticed the difference in herself before she noticed it anywhere else. A quality of stillness that was not resignation, but resolution. The particular internal quiet of someone who has made a decision and is living inside it before it becomes fully visible to the world. She moved through Margaret's house with the same deliberate pace she always had. Answered letters, reviewed the preliminary notes she had begun drafting for Lord Holt's framework. Supervised Clara's lessons, helped Margaret with the household accounts one afternoon when Aldous' clerk was ill. But underneath all of it was the settled knowledge of what came next, and that knowledge changed the texture of everything it touched. Clara knew something had shifted. She was 5 years old and possessed of her father's precise, watchful intelligence, and she had been living in her aunt's house for 9 months, absorbing the quality of her mother's moods, the way children absorb everything completely without commentary, filling in the understanding gradually from observation. She did not ask directly. Instead, on the 3rd evening after their return from Wexford, she climbed into Elizabeth's lap after supper, too old for it really, but neither of them acknowledged that, and said into Elizabeth's collarbone, "Henry says home is where you decide it is." Elizabeth held her daughter. "Henry is very wise," she said. The same words the Dowager had said, and she felt the echo of them with a fullness she hadn't expected. "Are we going home?" "Yes, love, we're going home." Clara was quiet for a moment. "To Papa's house." "To our house." Elizabeth pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head. "Papa's house is our house. It always was. We just needed some time away from it." "Because of the thing with the money and Uncle Thomas." Elizabeth went still. "Yes," she said, because Clara deserved the truth in whatever form she could carry it. "Because of that." "Is Uncle Thomas sorry?" "Yes, I believe he is." Clara considered this with the gravity that characterized all her significant thinking. "Captain bit one of Margaret's boys last month," she said finally, "and he was very sorry after. Margaret's boy forgave him because Captain looked sorry in his whole body, not just his face." Another pause. "Henry says you can tell the difference." Elizabeth closed her eyes for one moment. "Henry is right," she said. "You can." She told Margaret the following morning over tea in the kitchen, where they had sat together through every stage of the past 9 months. The arrival, the letter writing, the audit updates, the parliamentary committee, the Wexford visit, all of it. Margaret listened. Then she put down her cup and said, "Good." Elizabeth looked at her sister. "That's all. What else do you want me to say?" Margaret's voice was entirely level. "I've watched you work through this for 9 months. I've watched you become someone who was already inside you, but hadn't had room to fully exist yet. I've watched Leonard come here every Sunday and do the work of becoming someone worth coming back to. I've watched my niece establish a naval command structure in my upstairs bedroom." She paused. "Good is the right word. It covers all of it. I thought you might have opinions about whether it's wise. I have many opinions. None of them are useful at this point." Margaret looked at her steadily. "You didn't come back because he pressured you. You didn't come back because of obligation or title, or because you were afraid of what the alternative looked like. You came back because you watched him choose correctly, repeatedly, over a long period of time, and you made a decision based on evidence." She picked up her cup. "That's the most Elizabeth thing you have ever done. Why would I have opinions about it?" Elizabeth looked at her sister. This woman who had opened her door at midnight 9 months ago and said nothing, and made tea, and been throughout everything exactly what was needed. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. You have done the same for me." Immediately, and without question. "Then we're even." Margaret rose and began clearing the cups. "Now go right to Lord Holt before the framework designs itself without you." Elizabeth returned to Wexford on a Tuesday in late June, in the same carriage that had carried her away in November with Clara beside her, and a trunk of correspondence and draft methodology notes, and one slightly battered cloth rabbit, who had achieved the rank of admiral in 9 months of Bath command. The house looked the same as it always had from the drive. It would always look the same from the drive. That was the nature of old houses. They absorbed the life inside them, without changing their faces. What was different was Elizabeth, and what Elizabeth carried with her, and what she knew now about what a house could be asked to hold. Leonard was at the door. Not performing the welcome, simply there, because he had known what time the carriage was expected, and had not pretended otherwise. He looked at her when she stepped down, and the look was the same one he had given her in the garden in February, when she'd said, "We start there." Unguarded, careful, containing something he was not going to say, until it was true, in a way that could bear the weight of being said. Clara went to him without ceremony, delivered a formal briefing on Henry's current rank, and the status of Captain's rehabilitation under the new Bath command structure, and then announced that she needed to see whether Mrs. Finch had been properly managing the garden cat situation in their absence, and disappeared around the side of the house before anyone could respond. Leonard watched her go. "She's been running that household since December," Elizabeth said. "Margaret's boys have the look of men who've been organized for the first time in their lives." A pause. "Thank you for bringing her back." "She wanted to come." Elizabeth held his gaze. "So did I." He nodded once and stepped aside to let her in, and she walked back into the house that bore her name. Her name, not just by title, but by the work she had done inside it, and for it, and despite it, and felt the particular sensation of something settling into its right position after a long misalignment. It was not the same as it had been. She had promised him that, and she had promised herself, and the promise held. The first evening proved it. After supper, Leonard spread the estate's quarterly accounts on the library table. The same library, the same table, the same room where everything had broken open 7 months ago, and he did not present them to her. He set them between them both and said, "I want you to look at what Carrington has been doing since February. I have concerns about 2 line items in the household maintenance fund, and I would like your assessment before I speak with him." Elizabeth looked at the accounts. She looked at her husband. "2 line items," she said. "Third quarter household maintenance. The numbers add up. But the relationship between the maintenance expenditure and the improvement projects looks wrong." She felt the sharpening, that precise, clean attention that had started with a 47-pound discrepancy in a routine accounting notice, and had ended up before a parliamentary committee designing national audit standards. "Show me which ones," she said, and pulled the ledger toward her. They spent an hour at the library table, and it was nothing like the evening in November. It was entirely structurally different, because they were sitting on the same side of the information, both of them looking at numbers that neither of them was trying to protect. Leonard asked questions. Elizabeth answered them. Elizabeth raised a concern about a third-line item he hadn't flagged. They disagreed briefly and without heat about whether the deviation was significant enough to warrant speaking with Carrington before the quarter closed, and Elizabeth was right, and Leonard accepted that she was right without making it into anything other than a practical conclusion. It was the most ordinary hour Elizabeth had spent in this house in years. Ordinary in the way that something functions properly, not dramatically, not triumphantly, simply correctly. The way a well-maintained account looks different from a neglected one, not in any single dramatic line, but in the accumulated rightness of all the relationships between the numbers. She understood, sitting there in the library, with the ledger between them, that this was what she had actually wanted. Not the grand gesture, not the public reckoning, not even the parliamentary framework. Though she wanted all of those things. This. A husband who spread the accounts between them and asked her to look because he trusted what she would find. The framework for Lord Holt occupied the following months, in a way Elizabeth had not quite anticipated, not because the work was harder than she had expected, but because it was more alive. She had imagined it as a largely solitary exercise, the translation of her own methods into a standardized language. It turned out to be something else entirely, a collaboration, an argument, a series of conversations with auditors and fund administrators and parliamentary clerks, and most unexpectedly, with the women who had been writing to her from Harrogate and Leeds and York. Because it turned out that the woman in York, who had spent 23 years being told her opinions on financial matters were not her concern, had opinions on financial matters that were not only her concern, but exactly the kind of concern the framework needed. Her name was Mrs. Cordelia Ashby. She was 58 years old and had managed her late husband's printing business for the 6 years between his illness and his death, during which time she had developed entirely independently and from entirely different circumstances, a version of the same relationship-based analysis that Elizabeth had developed at Wexford. She had written her first letter to Elizabeth in November, the cautious letter about 23 years and other people's certainty about what was her concern. She had written 3 more since, each one slightly less cautious than the last. Elizabeth wrote to her in July, asking if she would be willing to contribute her methodology notes to the framework project. Mrs. Ashby's response arrived within a week. It was 12 pages long and was the most useful document Elizabeth had received since Carstairs's audit. She brought it to London in August for the first full committee meeting, and she put it on the table in front of Lord Holt and said, "This is from a woman in York. She developed this independently. I want her involved in the project formally." Lord Holt read the first 3 pages. "Get her to London," he said. "She doesn't have the funds for the journey. The committee will cover it." He looked up. "If this is what her thinking looks like when she's been managing it by herself for 20 years, I want to know what it looks like when she has resources." Elizabeth wrote to Mrs. Ashby that evening from her London hotel room. She wrote, "The committee will cover your travel and accommodation. I want you to know before you decide that this will not be a ceremonial role. There will be people in that room who are accustomed to being the authority, and your contribution will challenge some of their methods. That tends to create friction. I am telling you this because I want you to decide with full information, not because I think you will find it prohibitive." Mrs. Ashby wrote back, "I have been managing friction for 58 years. I will be in London on the 14th. She was. And she was, as Lord Holt had suspected, and Elizabeth had known, formidable. By the end of August, the framework had a shape. By October, it had a structure. By December, a year and 1 month after Elizabeth had left the library at Wexford, with a stack of annotated documents and a decision that had cost her everything she thought she had, it had a draft ready for committee review. Leonard read the full draft the night before it went to the committee. He read it at the library table with Elizabeth across from him, going through her own notes, and he did not speak until he had finished the last page. Then he set it down. "There's a section in Part 3, he said carefully. "The section on the relationship between administrative growth rates and program expenditure." "Yes." "You've footnoted it as a methodology developed in independent parallel by 2 analysts, you and Mrs. Ashby." "Yes, that's accurate. You haven't named the specific estate where you developed it." "No." He looked at her. "That's generous," he said. "To us." Elizabeth considered this. "I developed it here," she said. "At this table effectively over 6 years of quarterly accounts. The fact that I developed it here doesn't implicate Wexford in anything. It's simply where the work happened. I don't need to name a location to tell the truth." Some people would have named it. Some people would have. I'm not making a statement about the Ashford estate. I'm making a statement about what happens when women are actually allowed to manage accounts instead of being managed away from them. She held his gaze. "Those are different statements." Leonard looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "They are." The committee approved the framework in January of 1816. Lord Holt presented it to the full parliamentary session in February. The methodology which the committee named, with the dry bureaucratic efficiency of parliamentary bodies, everywhere, the Standard Framework for Charitable Fund Oversight, 1876, was adopted across every charitable institution under parliamentary regulation by the following spring. Elizabeth was in Yorkshire when the adoption was confirmed at the Ashford Children's Hospital for the formal opening of the renovated East Wing. She stood with Leonard and Dr. Holt and Miss Prentice and the hospital board, and a room full of donors and staff, and most importantly patients, including a boy of 9, who moved slightly slowly on account of a recovery that was going better than anyone had predicted, and who had progressed in the year since Elizabeth had first seen him. From drawings of horses to drawings of ships, James showed her his latest one, A three-masted vessel in full sail, rendered with the confident line of someone who has decided that the medium will submit to their intentions. "That's extraordinary," Elizabeth said, meaning it entirely. "I'm going to be a naval officer," James announced. He looked at her with Leonard's kind of eyes, precise, assessing, not missing anything. "Dr. Holt says you're the reason this ward is better." "Dr. Holt gives me more credit than I deserve." "He says that's what you say." James looked at her steadily. "He also says that's what people who actually deserve the credit always say." Elizabeth looked at this 9-year-old boy in the renovated ward that £12,418 had been stolen from and returned to, and felt something so complete and unambiguous move through her that she could not have named it with a single word, and did not try. "Keep drawing," she said. "I always do." Leonard was at her side when she turned away from James's bed, and he had heard every word, and he did not say anything about it, because he understood he had been understanding with increasing accuracy for 14 months, that some things are exactly the right size as they are, and do not need to be made larger. They walked back through the ward together, shoulder to shoulder, not performing anything, just present in the same place, carrying the same knowledge of what the place had cost and what it had become. "The East Wing," Elizabeth said. "Better than the plans. Miss Prentice negotiated a better rate on the stone than the original estimate." "I know, she told me. She seemed pleased." "She should be. She saved the board £400 and applied it to the pharmacy stores." Elizabeth paused. "She's been offered a position at the London hospital." "I know that too." Leonard kept walking. "I hope she takes it." Elizabeth looked at him. "You'd lose the best treasurer this hospital has had." "The best treasurer this hospital has had deserves the position that reflects what she's actually capable of," he said evenly. "The London hospital is a larger institution. She'd have more authority and more impact. Keeping her here because she's useful to us is the same logic that kept you from being anything but a duchess for the first 6 years of our marriage." Elizabeth stopped walking. Leonard stopped too. "You just said that," she said. "Yes." "Unprompted." "Yes." She looked at this man, her husband, the Duke of Wexford, the man who had told her to stay silent or leave, and had spent 14 months becoming someone who said things like that unprompted, because he had come to believe them in the part of himself where belief actually lives. "Who are you?" she said. "And what have you done with the man I married 7 years ago?" Something moved across his face, the rare unguarded version of his smile, the one he mostly kept for Clara, and very occasionally for Elizabeth, when he forgot to keep it managed. "I'm what's left," he said, "after you insisted on the truth." She looked at him for a long moment. "I like what's left," she said. "Good. Quiet. Direct. Because it's the only version I have." They continued through the ward, and out into the corridor, and back toward the boardroom, where the formal reception was waiting, and the distance between them was the comfortable distance of two people who have stopped performing proximity and started simply occupying the same space. And that was better than proximity had ever been when it was performed. The reception was long and loud with goodwill, and Elizabeth moved through it with the ease of someone who had learned in the past year that she was genuinely good at this. Not the social performance of a duchess, but the substance of it. The ability to make a donor feel that their contribution had been seen, and a patient feel that their presence was the point of the whole enterprise. Mrs. Alderton found her near the end of the evening. The Midlands Fund proceeding had concluded 2 months earlier, a quieter resolution than the Ashford case, but a real one with restitution and new oversight, and a formal acknowledgement that the concerns Mrs. Alderton had raised for 2 years had been entirely well-founded. "I have been waiting," Mrs. Alderton said, "for the appropriate moment to say something to you." Elizabeth waited. "My husband told me when this all began that I was borrowing trouble, that my concerns about the fund accounts were the product of anxiety rather than analysis." She held Elizabeth's gaze steadily. "He has since reviewed the proceedings and retracted that, in writing, at my request." A pause. "I requested it in writing because I had read about how the Ashford case was documented, and I thought that true things should be recorded." Elizabeth felt something warm and complete move through her. "That's exactly right," she said. The carriage back to the inn was quiet. Clara, who had attended the ward opening with the seriousness of a person who understood in her child's complete and accurate way that the occasion mattered, had fallen asleep against Elizabeth's arm before they had gone a mile, and Leonard sat across from them with his long legs arranged around the carriage's limited space, and his expression the quiet, settled one he wore when he was not managing anything. "I have a question," he said after several miles. Elizabeth shifted Clara's weight carefully. "Ask it." He looked at her directly. "Do you believe I can be worthy of you?" He said it without the defensive architecture that would have made it a rhetorical appeal for reassurance. He said it the way he said everything now, as a direct question that deserved a direct answer, regardless of what that answer was. Elizabeth looked at her husband across the carriage in the dark, with their daughter asleep between them and the road unrolling behind them toward everything they were building and everything they still had to build. She thought about what worthy meant and what it cost, and how it was not a state of being, but a practice, something you chose daily, over the easier alternative, until the choice became the character, and the character became the man. She thought about annotated margins, about a carved wooden compass, about "I told him that was your decision to make," about a man who stood 2 steps behind her at a social reception because he had decided that was where he belonged that evening, about estate accounts spread on a library table with no performance attached, just 2 people looking at the same information from the same side. She thought about "the least I can do is say so loudly enough that the people she was right about can hear it." "I don't need the Duke of Wexford to be worthy of me," she said. That was never the question. The Duke of Wexford was always worthy of a duchess. That's what titles are for. She held his gaze. "I needed the man I married to become someone who understood what he had, and to choose it, deliberately and at cost, and without any guarantee that the choosing would be enough." Leonard was very still. "That man," she said, "is in this carriage. He has been in this carriage for some time. And yes, I believe he is worthy. Not because he is without flaw, but because he knows his flaws accurately and chooses correctly despite them." She paused. "That is the most any of us can do." He held her gaze for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said. "Deserve it tomorrow, and the day after. Yes. No qualification, no hesitation. Yes, every day." Clara stirred slightly against Elizabeth's arm, resettled, and slept on. The carriage moved through the dark Yorkshire night, carrying them toward morning and toward Wexford, and toward the life they were building out of what had been broken, and what had been salvaged, and what had been built entirely new from the ground up. It was not the marriage Elizabeth had imagined at 24. It was not the life she had expected when she spoke her vows in a country church in Berkshire with complete sincerity and incomplete information. It was harder than that and more honest and earned in a way that nothing unearned can be. It was a marriage between 2 people who knew each other accurately, not flatteringly, not conveniently, but accurately, and had chosen each other anyway, with full understanding of what the choosing required. And when they arrived home at Wexford in the early morning light, and Leonard carried a sleeping Clara up the stairs without waking her, and Elizabeth stood for a moment in the entrance hall of the house that had her name on it, in every way that mattered, she understood fully and without reservation that the woman who had walked out of this house 9 months ago with a stack of annotated documents and a decision that had cost her everything. She thought she had not lost anything that was truly hers. She had simply insisted that the life she lived be equal to the truth she knew. And she had been right to insist. She had always been right to insist. That was the thing about the truth. It did not require anyone's permission to be true.